Hello everyone, my name is Adam Mahmutovic, as you all know, and I'm a Bosnian Swedish writer, an academic, and I wanted to start a series of readings. Uh, I, I've always felt that when doing readings of my own work at different events, it's always been a great experience, and a lot of my writing is based on oral storytelling, and much of it has that kind of quality of orality. So I decided to kind of just go through some of the stories, maybe excerpts from my novels, in preparation for the release of the latest novel, which will come out in late April or beginning of May. I won't tell you more about that novel, but just to say that I wanted to read a story which was one of the first stories that I wrote back when shortly after we left the refugee camps and kind of settled in different places and so on. It's a very it's it's a very raw kind of young story by a young person kind of experiencing being in a new environment, and being in conflict about what do we owe our countries. Can we love them and still be distant from them? Can we avoid being nationalistic and love our countries? Is that possible? So on March the 1st was the Bosnian Independence Day, a big day for Bosnia when more than 90% people voted in the referendum for Bosnia to be an independent country, to separate from Yugoslavia. And um, and a lot of things ensued. A lot of bad things happened, and we still talk about the effects of nationalism. How that ruined the country, the war, and all that followed. Um, and it's been like my life project to think about the myths of the country, the myths of the people, the myths of the nation, and so on. And I found it personally that it is possible to show great love for a country, for a nation, for your people, without being nationalistic, without being prejudiced against other ethnicities, other religions, and so on. And in fact, that um, that kind of aversion to prejudice and aversion to mythology, he actually comes from a sense of religion, from a sense of the faith that kind of goes through all my work, uh, not in a very typical sense that people would perhaps look for, or try to identify and see in terms of tropes, but more in terms of the spirituality uh, which tries to cut deep and reach for love, for a sense of compassion, for a sense of sharing, community that crosses borders, community that exists in multiple places at the same time. So, for this reason, I will read you that one of the first stories I ever wrote, which is called The Myth of the Smell. I hope you'll enjoy it. Myth of the Smell. Sometimes I think the only real home for a refugee is an endless road. In second place, I don't know, maybe a bus. I feel like I've spent more time on different buses than in all the camps. Refugee camps, of course. These shelters end up in third place. I have nothing to put under number four. I don't seem to even have an all time top five list. But this you already know. I will not offer you dull, simple stereotypes of the idea of a refugee. You need to hear something that elucidates the being of a refugee in a different way. This is not a parable or a metaphor, even though it might look like one. It's, I don't know, you'll see. This shows what it's like to be well accommodated in a foreign country and yet still long for a home to nestle in. And even though I view home with suspicious eyes, I too have come down with a nauseating homesickness, which made me think I belonged to a people, not the Bosnians, but rather the race of refugees. The moment my bus mates left Bosnia, they chanted like little Dorothy, "There's no place like home." I was at first reluctant to describe the homeland, its fragrances, tints, and textures. I just don't believe any refugee really has a clear memory of these things, but rather a vague feeling about something that might be causing our quirky behaviors. At the beginning of our stay in this town, Mulchur, located between a muddy lake and an evergreen forest, we started off on a new life by facing a new language. The tongues of adults twisted and bent in desperate attempts to pronounce even three-word sentences. "Oh, come on, for God's sake," I used to tease them. "Thank goodness we're not in China or Eskimo land. It'd take you ages to learn how to say, 'May I have some bread?' Be grateful that they have supermarkets here so you can just see where things are and take what you need instead of asking for each item from the grocer sitting behind the counter." I exaggerated, of course, but you should have seen us walking those clean, broad streets, unwilling to look at the scarce passers-by, afraid they might ask us something. I guess the locals in this place hadn't had too many gastarbeiter from the Balkans, so they told us we were surprisingly white for Muslims. Some of us were blonde and blue-eyed. Still, you could recognize us from a mile's distance. The ambling gait and the mismatched second-hand clothes, the lowered eyes and the hair starred by brain-numbing winds. We improved. I liked how the new homeland reflected in the lake, except in winter where it froze over and people drove cars across the ice to the other side where there was a hotel and an art school. The refugee camp was made of long two-story houses with 4 to 6 flats in each house, and only two families in each flat. Picture frustrated husbands, constantly smoking, whining about the good old days, and starving for news broadcasts, Deutsche Welle, Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, and their dishwashing, food cooking wives telling them to move their asses for once. Kids taking every opportunity to watch MTV. Can you think of a worse place for a refugee than this? I once asked Björn, one of the camp personnel, a curious man who liked walking among us. He'd left his factory job, his marriage, all that jazz. he was trying his luck here. Of course I can, he said, looking at me with ice blue eyes. He looked almost like an albino, and straight from a 40s film, the hair bright and sleek, a Robin Hood moustache. He always breathed as if rushing somewhere. Smelled nice though, lemongrass. I was afraid he had seen the question as proof of my ungratefulness or a sign of some Slavic pride. I asked him what he meant. You know why? Because there is no place like home. I gave that hint. I know what you're thinking, such a cliche, huh? But I've been observing you Bosnians for a while now, and I just don't get it. I mean, I do, but it seems to me that you love this, if you will excuse the expression, Bosnia, or ver alt annat, more than anything. You see, these last 6 months now that the war's ended and all, I've seen people go back to their homeland and stay there for a month or two. In fact, they go as far as buying expired foods, digging for clothes in those yellow oof containers, walking out on early Saturday mornings to gather empty cans and anything else to raise money for a bus ticket. They tell me people back home expect them to come back with money as if they were Gastarbeit. Well, since they did not defend the country, they should at least pay back something, I thought. When they return, they have a different zeal in their eyes and a feeling of disappointment of being here. I don't understand. Why don't they just go back there for good? Because there really is no such place as home, I thought and smiled. I used to tease my fellow countrymen for their homesickness, telling them if they long for their hearths and doorsteps, oftentimes the only remnants of their burnt down houses, why didn't they just pack their bags and leave this place where they had failed to find fertile soil for their roots? Boy, I hated those metaphors. I'd say, Bosnia is free now, so why not get the hell out of this paradise with apple trees and leaves big enough to cover your groin? Because we are cowards? Or maybe because we, in our most intimate nooks, in our ADU conversations, really do not believe there is a place like home. We know that the moment we passed the booth with the sully-faced border guard, our homeland was erased and turned into someone else's tabula rasa, left for others to carve their marks, the marks of their lives into it. I would tease them, but it would hurt me to see them purse their lips and mutter, "You're such a killjoy." And with any indication of even the faintest thought that there maybe was nothing left to live for in Bosnia, sneers and suspicion, even from those who had begun to think in the same groove, would fall upon the turncoat. Mine was not an easy confession. The Swede continued. They always talk about Bosnian smells, how wonderful it feels to breathe there, while here they're choking. I find it so condescending. I love the way my country is. What's so much better about Bosnia? She can tell you, I said, pointing at Niazita, waddling towards us with a tray, 3 glasses clinking, a lemonade running over their brims. Niazita is an old maid, as people have a nasty habit of saying, as old in face as the dress she's been wearing since she was a young woman. Childless, homeless, almost friendless, always shaky as if freezing, her eyelids only slightly swollen. She's been taking care of me for 2 years. Hers were the first pair of arms around me after my parents and my 7 brothers died. I don't even know how. I hadn't been there to see their deaths. I was lying under a sweaty, panting slob miles away. Niazita, I said, and she shyly put the tray in front of us, avoiding the guy's eyes. This man asks what Bosnia smells like. Could you tell him and I'll translate? She sat down beside me, looked at the plastic table, then began to speak as if she'd been waiting for this opportunity all her life. Our houses smell of cold and fresh lime on early summer mornings after the regular spring whitewashing. This pungent, tickling smell fades away a little every day thereafter. The summers pullulate with outdoor smells, budding trees of lilac, bramble, quince, plums, pears, and apples. Meadow flowers bloom into winter time. The wind never blows like it does here, incessantly, making you drowsy. They come and go, carrying the smells of seasons, eddying through space like a Ramadan moves through time. Sometimes moody like old people, sometimes just tired or strong, confining you indoors until you start sweating nervously. Or they disappear completely, to later breeze by when the worst heat comes over us. In winter, the lime evaporates stingily, fusing with the softly bitter smell of dry tree sap that seeps through the crevices of the stove, where it smolders in burning logs like big incense. Then these then flow up and down in confluence with other plumes from the stove, veal and mutton, tomatoes, strong red paprika, beans, clove bits, scattered over the hot plates, plum and pear compote, simmering milk turning into a fat crust at the surface that we eat with apple syrup and dark bread. These smells embrace cold afternoons and evenings, rubbing themselves against the cool air as one would rub one's hands to warm up. These Swedish flats smell only of dirty wallpaper, linoleum floors that don't creak when you walk over them, and other building odors. These windows face only the walls of other buildings or other windows with shades rolled down. Björn could hardly wait until I finished translating. He seemed to have understood what she was getting at from her face twitching, the oscillations in her breathing, and the vehemence of her arm movements. But for Christ's sake, you're in a refugee camp. Our regular homes and yards have all the nice smells as well. No, no, Yazita flailed her arms. You just don't get it. It's, as people say, indescribable. Bosnian smells are special. They have a certain texture as they move in the air, like fine cashmere. They are sweeter, sourer, bitterer, and mellower in their ripeness, like the greeting arms of a father. I caressed her cheeks. I think he's got it now. Björn was upset and tried to counter Nyazeta's patriotism. He said, I've read that Bosnia is so war torn now that the streets are like fetid rubbish containers. Nothing works there. The locals dump garbage in rivers and abandoned backyards. They don't think the world of their country. They're hungry, jobless, and pissed off. They'd leave at the first opportunity, but no country wants you now. Then he heaved a breath as if he had swum up to the surface of our lake and went on rumbling about everything that just stank. Corruption, drugs, something about his friends serving in the blue helmets, better known as Smurfs, who were constantly offered sex by young girls who reputedly wanted to get pregnant and so cheat their way out of the country. Even I could not listen to this, let alone translate to Nyazita. I sipped at my tasteless beverage, avoiding his eyes, giving him the deaf ear until he gave up and said goodbye. And that was all. It always cuts both ways. No winners or losers. Or maybe there always are losers. My Swedish friend was right, in two ways. Such mythologizing and romanticizing of that little piece of land where we were and did not learn to appreciate until now is just silly. But he noticed one more important thing: it's an incurable condition. I asked him if there was a worse place for us than this, and he correctly answered yes. City would not be better than this forest town. It would bring back memories of the throngs of emaciated people in school gymnasiums and the high ceilings of religious buildings where we lived the first weeks as refugees, as if it were the beginning of a career. All the city stores and boutiques would speak of the things we didn't dare buy, for we had to travel light. Smells from street kitchens would remind us we needed to eat too fast. Now a city would be an even worse refuge. Still, wherever we are, there remains the myth, all defined, capitalized, and italicized, built up from scratch into one of the most magnificent air castles between heaven and hell. I wish my Swedish friends were here when Rabia came back after a 2 months visit to her village in northern Bosnia. Then he would have seen how ridiculously homesick we could be. Rabia's house was no longer occupied, and the government wanted her to register a request for her property to be returned to her. She needed to register as a returning refugee. So she hurried back to her place of birth to make sure the administration was working on her case. The authorities had assured her that the house would be empty of the people then living in it and returned to her within a year or so, all according to the Dayton Accords and the current mood in the neighborhood. After completing all the paperwork, she kissed her rusty doorknob goodbye and returned to Sweden, even though she had no family here. She was hoping to get the money that the Swedish government had promised to the returnees. As she stepped down from the train and into the Swedish forest, the folks gathered around her like bees around their queen and asked what ought to be asked. What was it like? What could it be like other than what the Swede had described? But every time someone visited their homeland, everyone else spent the time biting their nails, anticipating the news of the post-war home. The impressions of others would become their own. Never did we hear about the disappointments. Whatever was said was slanted over with a common closing sentence. What can I tell you? Even the soil smells good back there. Then everybody would relax as if set free, exhaling a month or two of built up expectations. They laughed and chatted for a moment, intoxicated by this happy message that the motherland itself had sent them. Tell them I'm fragrant. Tell them I'm sweet. Tell them I'm beautiful. Tell them I love them. In a transparent amendment, just don't send them back for a while, will you? I'm so damn tired. Rabia took her time, reticent, expressionless, breathing ceased. Then she reached into the pocket of her washed out cardigan and exclaimed, I brought you a piece of the land. I lunged forward and buried my nose in that piece of pale dirt and grass and heaved a deep breath. A second later, I was pushed away. Everyone wanted to smell the piece of Bosnian soil that had traveled about 3,000 kilometers to rekindle their nostrils. It had no smell whatsoever. Then again, we knew it wouldn't. Still, everyone burst out, it smells wonderful, and chatted for a moment about the peculiar qualities of Bosnian smells and about how Bosnian food, its breads and meats, was sweeter than the dozens of varieties found in Swedish bakeries and shops. It was all as Nyazeta had tried to convey to the Swede. What about the truth? I wondered and looked up the broad road to the refugee camp. I waved my hands. What about it? It doesn't smell good.